going to have a look here at the advantages and the disadvantages of monopoly. Now, advantages, disadvantages, one of those key things you need to know about each market structure. It's something that is getting a good bit of coverage in recent exams, advantages and disadvantages. So in 2024, we had a question that looked for one advantage of monopolistic competition. The year before that, 2023, we had a question that looked for one advantage and one disadvantage of perfect competition. And then the year before that, again, we had a question that looked for one advantage of monopoly and one advantage of oligopoly. So with those questions, you'll notice that they're not looking for more than 2 points in any of them. And when we look here at the advantages and disadvantages of monopoly, and if you have the book open in front of you there, you're looking in the notes and you'll see 5 advantages and 5 disadvantages. If I was you, I wouldn't be learning off all 5 because it's highly unlikely the exam question's ever going to ask you for more than 2. So I'm going to point you here towards 3 that I think are easiest to remember. And the reason they're easy to remember is because the points actually look like they contradict each other a little bit. So don't be worried about that. That's fine. That can happen. So sometimes you can argue that something will be an advantage. Sometimes you can argue it will be a disadvantage. It just depends what happens to the market structure and which way it actually plays out in reality. So if I show you the points here and you mark them into your books there with me, you'll see it might make a little bit more sense. Right, so the first thing is there you have on the advantages side, if you're looking, you'll see it says economies of scale. So remember, economies of scale are the forces at work that lead to a reduction in long-run average costs of a firm as the firm grows in size. So basically, they're the things that happen to a business that lead to its average cost falling just because it's getting bigger. So if you're thinking about like, well, how is that an advantage? Well, it's an advantage because if a firm benefits from economies of scale and they can produce each unit pretty cheaply, it means that they can charge less for it. So it's an advantage to the consumer if the firm does have economies of scale and they pass that on to the consumer in the form of lower prices, right? And you have to be a big firm to benefit from economies of scale. So like we saw this in oligopoly, one of the advantages there where there was economies of scale, but in the other market structures, disadvantage, firms don't benefit from economies of scale. So it's linked to the consumer. The benefit really is to the consumer. So production on a large scale there may help the firm benefit from economies of scale, and these cost savings may be passed on to the consumer in the form of lower prices. So it just gives an example there of economies of scale. Bulk purchasing, buying a lot of raw materials in bulk. Because you're buying a lot of them, you get a good discount, which means per unit that you produce, it costs you a little bit less, right? But if you look over on the disadvantages side, you'll see higher prices. So over here, we're saying economies of scale might lead to lower prices. But then the first disadvantage is, there's higher prices. But this is coming at it from a slightly different perspective. This is looking on monopoly market structure like from the perspective that there's no one else competing in the market, that there's no one there to compete them, there's no one to keep the monopolist honest. And that they can totally exploit the consumer because there's no competition. So monopolies, they can charge high prices, particularly compared to perfect competition, simply because there is no competition, the last point there. So you see they're slightly contradictory. We're saying there might be low prices, might be high prices, and it just depends. Yeah, you can make a case for either there. The next point then to show you is if you look at point number 4 down here, it says that monopoly will lead to reduced use of scarce resources, and that's an advantage. So the reason it's seen as an advantage, or the reason why it's really saying that this is an advantage compared to other market structures. So maybe the best way to think about it is like, let's say in a more competitive market structure where there's more firms competing, let's say it's the energy sector. You might have 2 energy companies that are, let's say, looking to build a power plant or something like that. And maybe they're both looking at building one in the same location. In that location, there's a limited amount of land, there's a limited amount of water, there's a limited amount of fuel, there's a limited amount of resources as a whole. And if they both build plants there, well, they're both using up those natural resources. But if there was only one firm who did that, they'd be using up less of the resources. So there is an argument to say that in a monopoly, there's a reduced use of scarce resources because there's less duplication of things. So that's the idea. So if 2 companies were to compete for scarce resources, there will be a duplication of resources. Monopolies eliminate that inefficiency. But then if you look over here in the disadvantages, it says that monopoly is wasteful of resources, but this is looking at it from a different perspective. This is coming back to our whole thing about average costs and at the minimum point of your average cost curve. So we looked in a previous video what the equilibrium position is for monopolists, and we saw that, well, in equilibrium, when they produce the profit maximizing quantity, it's not a quantity that's at the minimum point of our average cost curve, which is seen as wasteful of scarce resources. So a monopolist does not produce at that lowest point of AC. That means they're wasting their scarce resources. Then there is a third point, which is also contradictory. So if you look down here, The last advantage there, it says monopoly, there's potential for innovation and research and development. And the idea here is that because they make supernormal profits, they have some money that they can actually use to invest in research and development and getting better. The kind of these excess funds left over. You know, the entrepreneur would be happy with normal profit by definition. So supernormal profit is like this excess funds or excess profit that can be used to actually make the product better. And yeah, that could happen. That could be one of the things that happens. So the supernormal profits that are earned by monopolies can be reinvested into research and development. And for us as consumers, that will lead to better products. But you could also argue that monopoly may see a lack of innovation. So that can be seen as a disadvantage. So again, it's kind of contradictory. We're saying, well, there might be innovation because they have money to innovate. But at the same time, we're saying there might be no innovation. And this is, again, coming back to the kind of idea that there's nothing there to keep the monopolist honest in terms of competition. There's nothing to motivate them to do better. Nothing to motivate them to improve their product because they own the market as it is. So you can see how monopoly is bad for consumers there and how like it's in the government's interest and regulatory authorities. It's in their interest to make sure that monopolies don't happen because like what a terrible situation if firms are under no pressure to get better and innovate and give us better products. So the lack of competition there, it means that a monopolist, they've no incentive to innovate or develop new products or services. So we don't benefit in that case from better products. So you'll see there's 5 of each there, but I wouldn't bother with 5. I've just shown you 3. Let's keep the video nice and short. I focus on those 3, learn them and know that you can use them on either side, advantage or disadvantage. And I think that makes them easy to remember.